Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Now, I don't normally do care videos about orchids because it's very subjective, and the big variable is where the orchids are being grown, because sort of growing them inside a home, on a windowsill or in a grow tent, outside, outside under shade, and I've got a grow room, so my environment is quite precise and quite specific. So what I do for my orchids could be misleading. Yeah, that's why I don't normally do care videos, because it can be misleading. You know, people who say this is what you must do for these types of orchids, well, that might not be the best way to look after them in your own environment. So you have to apply those variables. But given this environment, which I've gone over in quite a lot of detail, how do I look after? I've got representatives of about 30 genera. Yeah, but that's quite a variety of orchid types, and the only way I can cope with that is to split them up into sets. You've heard me talk about sets before, and that's all I can do is say how I look after the sets, because within those sets they all get treated the same. And this is during the growing season. Sorry about the rain, but I've been looking forward to that because of the garden and the outside stuff. But it does apply an amount of noise while I'm filming on the roof. Frightens the cats and all that. Mind you, that one don't look very frightened at the moment. Morning? No, I'm being dozy at the moment. That's Elvis, that's the short haired black and white. Anyway, how I split them up. First of all, I've got mounted orchids. And as far as I'm concerned, if they're on a mount, it doesn't matter to me what sort they are. They're going to get treated the same. They're going to get watered with the same frequency, which I've been a bit slack on lately for a reason I've stated. That seems to be getting better now, thank goodness. On that subject, I gave in. I'm not one for taking painkillers, but because I had a shop delivery coming, I thought, right, we'll add something in. So I had a look round at the sort of things suitable for back problems, and I found a cream that you apply locally to the spot that hurts, and it gets absorbed in and applies a direct painkiller. Quite honestly, it's done some good. So I wish I'd given in earlier. But today, my back is nothing more than a dull ache in the background. So I don't want to aggravate it and start it off again, but I'm getting there. It's getting better. So, orchids. I've got mounted orchids. Amongst my mounted orchids are some representatives of the Oncidium Alliance, the Cattleya Alliance, and a mass of Dendrobiums, Aurangis. Come on, think. That's probably about it. Oh, and I've even got a mounted Bulbophyllum. Yeah, so, oh, and I've got mounted Phalaenopsis. But they're all mounted orchids. So during, like, the growing season, they dry out daily. Unless I water late in the day, and it's a dull day followed by a dull day, they tend to get watered every day. Now, some of the waterings in recent times have been applied via a sprayer, which is not quite as good, because certainly when sphagnum moss is dry, using a sprayer you can often get a runoff effect where the water is not soaking in properly. It's not the same as holding the mount horizontally and pouring water over it, where the water goes right through the moss down to the mount, a proper good soak, which when the weather's warm, if I don't do that, they won't get properly watered. So I do have to do that. I've got away with it today because it's a dull day. Yeah, so as far as the mounts are concerned, I keep notes on what they were fed. So that's both a TDS level, what went into that, whether it was just MSU or MSU plus a bit of CalMag or CalMag on its own. And I also keep notes of the pH that was used for that particular feed. And I vary it around, you know. But I can say emphatically that I feed at low doses. Not everybody agrees with that, but it's what I do. And when you're feeding, well, watering with some feed virtually every day, if those doses are quite high, that's going to build up. That's going to do some harm. So my logic is feed low and frequently. Hopefully similar to what would happen in the wild. That's my theory. So that's the mounts out the way. And my theory with those in the growing season is feed and water well. You know, everything on a mount in here is in active growth of some shape or form. The dendrobiums are all pushing out new canes and new root systems. One of my Miltonias is coming into bloom, having produced 2 good new strong growths. So its growth has slowed right up now, but it's trying to produce flower spikes. Well, it's going to need some energy to do that. So as far as I'm concerned, feed and water well during the growing season, but with me, I keep the doses very low. And some people complain about people saying that sort of thing and then not giving some figures. So I'll give some figures. Now, I consider a low feed a TDS of about 80. Irrespective of its makeup, that's a low feed. Now, with my mounted orchids, I go up as high as 120. Very rarely do I go any higher, unless by accident I put a little bit too much fertilizer in the water and can't be bothered to water it down again. But if I go above 140, I would water it down again and bring it back down. I like to feed around 80 for a low dose and 120, 130 max for a stronger feed. And that's as strong as I ever go. And obviously this time of year, in the main, that's going to get soaked up and used. So that's the mounts out of the way. That was easy. Then we come down to the potted ones. The exception are the holy clay pots. The plants that are in those have a precise wet-dry cycle. That's what they need. If they stay wet, it does them harm in the root department. Yeah? So the stuff that's in the holy clay pots is in large chunky bark, and that's it. And they dry off an awful lot quicker than anything in a plastic pot. So I treat those separately. Feed levels, exactly the same as for the mounts. Feed low, frequently, keep records, swing the pH from high to low, and vary what they get on a regular basis. Frequency is still dependent on weather. Now, when we've got sunny days, the heat builds up in here. Obviously, evaporation from the pots is faster, and transpiration via the plants themselves is faster. So they're going to lose humidity from within the plant out through the leaves and through the pots via the clay pots and the very spacious airy media. So their watering frequency can come round every 3rd day, possibly even every 2nd day. And now I'm watering with the sprayer in the main. I have to water a bit more often because they're not getting that really good soak that I do with my normal watering style. So I've adjusted the frequency, but not the amount of feed. Yeah? Okay, so that's the holy clay pots. Frequency about every 3rd day. If we get a dull period, every 4th day. You know, if we get some real stonking heat in here, I might adjust that to every 2nd day. But I do make sure they are dry before they get watered again. And that's the key. It's not done via the calendar, it's done via what's going on in the pot. So if the pot's dry, it needs watering again. If it hasn't dried out, then no, it doesn't. It's quite simple. Might be difficult to tell, but you get used to your own plant. So that's the holy clay pots out of the way. Most of the plants that are in the holy clay pots are of the Cattleya alliance. Yeah, so they need that wet-dry cycle. So that's them out of the way. Then we come round to the plastic pots, and that's basically everything else. And obviously in amongst there is the greatest variety of different types of orchids. So can I still treat them all the same? No, not really, because there are quite major differences going on here. First of all, down in amongst the shady area are what I call the cooler growers that must stay moist and not dry out. Yeah. Now, as a consequence, their frequency of water can come round quite quickly, but they have a media suitable for staying moist longer. So it tends to be the small bark with sphagnum moss, and that helps them stay moist longer. Yeah. So I've adjusted the media for that orchid type. That's Restrepias, Masdevallias. I class my Miltoniopsis in the same category. Yeah, so that's those. And quite honestly, my Paphiopedilums, not that I've got many, are in the same boat. They don't like to dry out, and they tend to be in small bark and sphagnum, and they don't like high light. I mean, some will say they like better light than what the books say, but nonetheless, they're not highlight ones. Yeah, they're not up in the Cattleya sort of category. So that's the cool growers. And most of those, in fact, I'd quite emphatically say all of them. There's even a Dracula in amongst them. They do not like salt build-up. And that's the easiest thing to do when you've got a plant that needs to stay moist all the time, because the temptation is to keep pouring water in with feed. So with these, their flush comes round a lot more frequently, because any build-up, certainly on the Miltoniopsis, and their roots will keel over. So none of these like high levels of feed, and my maximum level of feed for these is 80, TDS of 80, and I don't mind it being as low as 50 or 60, yeah? But their flush comes round a lot more frequently. Make sure that media gets a good flush out for those types. So that's the what I call the cooler growers, yeah? And they're also ones that don't like high light. They're also ones that like to stay moist, so they're in a set of their own. And there isn't anything else really that comes into the same set, so I can treat that whole section there the same. Forget the basket. I wish I could. Right, then we come round to the next set. And the next set this time of year is really everything else. It might sound a little bit of an overkill, but in amongst the rest, everything else are mainly oncidiums and intergenerics of that type, but also my Latoria dendrobiums come into this class, so do my Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums. What else have we got lurking in amongst that set? The rest of the bulbophyllums, my Neophonetas. So I'm just scanning around trying to think what the hell else is in that set. But it is effectively everything else. Now this time of year is the growing season, yeah? And for some plants it's really the growing season, because as we go into autumn and the day lengths shorten, their growth will slow right down, as will everything else in here. That has to be borne in mind. If things are not growing vigorously, what are they not going to need? They're not going to need so much food. They're not going to need watering so frequently. Yeah. So in amongst this lot, I've got oncidium types. Well, a lot of the oncidium types don't have an annual cycle. They have a cycle of about 9 to 10 months, during which they will put out a new growth and mature it. And if you're lucky, bloom. No, they should do. They're one of the easiest types to bloom. They're predictable. But with a cycle like that, they could be maturing their growth in the middle of the summer. They could be maturing their growth in the middle of the winter. So these have to be watched a little more carefully, because if the new growths are pushing quite hard as you go into winter time, you've got to watch your watering. Because if you slow it down too much and they keep drying out, you're liable to get the old concertina leaves and you will stunt those new growths. But then if you keep them wet and soggy when your temperatures are low, that's not good for your root system. You just got to take each plant individually. And I've got quite a lot of oncidium types and intergenerics, and they're all maturing growths at different times of the year and at different rates. So I just have to take care. And what I do with those types is I let them get almost dry. I don't keep them permanently wet. And they seem to do okay on it. So If it's not broke, don't fix it. Simple as that. So they have a different growth cycle, they need a different approach. But nonetheless, their feed is adjusted according to what they're up to. I mean, a vigorous plant like this, I mean, that's pushed up 5 new growths recently. This one's chucked out so many I've lost count. Most of these larger plants on here are maturing growths and pushing up spikes or blooming. Yeah, so they use their water and feed up a lot quicker. So I have to keep my eye on them. I don't mind them getting virtually dry or even dry, but not for any length of time at all. Not in the growing season when there's heat around. Yeah, so it's just a adjustment at each plant level really, but collectively they do get treated virtually the same. You know, I can't do watering for some plants and then the next day some of the others and then the next day. I don't work like that. I tend to water in large swathes and everything gets some. And sometimes I water when a plant's not dried out yet. But in this growing season with the normal heat, it doesn't matter so much. But it does matter when it's cold. Yeah, so that's the rest of the set. Feed levels for vigorous oncidium types and things like that, they're up the top end of my feed. You know, they're up in the 120, 130 TDS mark. Nothing goes any higher than that. Not anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore. A little and often. So those really are the sets. And it's the sets that determine the care rather than the actual type of orchid. And certainly in the growing season, I don't have many sets. So they're all quite easy to look after. There is an exception. There's the bare-rooted stuff, obviously. The Vandas, these two ugly mothers down here. These are my, what are they, Rhinco Stylus. I've got another one lurking somewhere. Yeah, over there, that's my Bangkok Sunset. That's a Rhinco Reedies. Now that's growing well and pushing out some good new leaves. Well, some roots to go with it might be nice. I think there's 2 active roots in there at the moment. Very slow rooter, that one, or it is for me anyway. But those get a bucket dunk. Yeah, they get dunked in a bucket, and I change the water in the bucket when I get the RO unit out, which depends on how fast I use my RO water up. When it's warm, a lot more water. And unfortunately, due to circumstances and using the sprayer, I'm now wasting quite a bit of that because it's going through the pot straight on the floor. You know, some might say that's a good idea, but nonetheless, I'm getting through my water faster. Well, the good side of that is the bucket gets changed more often, so it freshens up the water. But in the bucket, I usually keep my feed level. First off, when the water's fresh, everything that gets watered in the bucket gets a dunk in the clean water and gets a good sploosh around to make sure that the roots are thoroughly washed off. And if they're in wooden baskets, the basket gets a good wash as well. So a good soak in clean water and a sploop and a slosh around, clean everything off that may have accumulated and start afresh. And then I put some feed in for the next water. And I still adjust that. You know, one level of feed with a higher pH up near the 6.4, 6.5 end. And then the next time when I refresh the water, they'll get a lower one. Now they're getting quite a few waterings at the same pH, which is not ideal. But what else can I do? Think about it. It's a bucket and it holds about 20 litres. I can't be changing that every couple of days. So they have to lump it. And are they doing okay? Well, let's have a think. The large Vanda up the end's got a nice large spike coming on it now, weighted to stop it hitting the roof. The manky one that got what we believe is cold damage in the winter now has a spike. This one has a spike coming, and when I watered it yesterday, that one has a second spike starting. So are they doing okay? Yeah, they're doing okay. They're not, strangely enough, the Vandas are not my favourite plants, but when they're in bloom, they come up near the top of the list. So there we go. I don't think I've missed anything. As I said, I vary the pH on my feed, and I keep notes a history of what's happened. So I can go to my notes and have a look, and like I usually go historically from a flush. Yeah, so that's my start point. And then I'll have a look at what they got next. Yeah, well, they might have got their feed level at a pH, say around 6.4, 6.5. Yeah, and then the next feed level will get down near the 5.8 mark. Yeah, I don't go any lower than 5.7 ever. I don't believe it's necessary. But getting down near the 5.8, that's a good idea. So I've then got a flush, high pH or higher pH, lower pH. What might they get next? Well, I could either go back to a high pH, or I could do a CalMag on its own feed. You know, I chop and change, but occasionally they do get a CalMag feed on its own. When I use the CalMag on its own, I aim for a pH of around 6. I don't mind 6.1, I don't mind 5.9, but I aim for around 6, and it doesn't have to be precise. And the idea of getting in around there is that the ingredients in there, it's a chelated product, so in theory all the nutrients and every elements involved in that particular watering are going to be absorbed at quite a wide range of pH. It doesn't have to be quite so precise. Nonetheless, it's recommended that product goes in at around the 6 mark. So that's what I do. That's what it says on the tin. That's what I do. But I keep that history, and then I refresh the history the next time I flush. And don't forget to flush now and again. Give everything a good wash through. Yeah? And if you want to be really fussy, do it again a few hours later. Yeah? And really give everything a good flush. The higher level you feed at, the more important that becomes, because you will get build-up. You will get, even if it's only individual elements of your feed that the plant's not taking in because it's already got enough. So go steady with your feed levels. So that's how I look after them. Light levels are adjusted by shelves. Yeah, depending on how far away from the roof they are. The light coming in from the sides doesn't change much, but it does to a degree. Take this top shelf. I've got light coming in from the side, light coming in from above, but the light coming in from up that end is pretty filtered. There's an awful lot of plants in the way, like this lot. So, yeah, its best light comes in from the side and from above. Yeah. If we move to this shelf, this gets light in from the side and from the end because there's nothing in the way. But then there's some quite large plants up that end and some tucked down behind. That's because they don't need it quite as bright. So that's what I call my light microclimates. And I can use a single plant to filter light to the 2 or 3 smaller ones sat behind it, even though they're on exactly the same shelf. So I can play with the light levels just by moving the plants around, both on the shelf they're on and depending on which shelf. Yeah, so I play with my light levels according to requirements. My Cattleya types are up here. So they're quite close to the roof and they're very near the end. That's next to what the Vandas get, that's my best light. It's still filtered through shade netting. It's not direct this time of year. Well, I've scorched leaves, and I have done that. So this shelf here gets a very similar light, but it's not quite as bright because it's masked from above. So it gets the same amount of light in through the end, but it doesn't get quite as much from above. Even though there's quite a bit of space above it, there's also a lot of plants and things above it. So again, the light level here is slightly less than here. Yeah? The light level here is at its brightest up in that corner and less the farther away you come. The light levels down here, coming in from both sides, but not quite so much from above, because that shelf's full of plants. So I play with my light levels, and I'll chop and change things. A couple of my Latorias were up on this top shelf, and they were starting to get signs of quite a bit of purple on the leaves. And I thought, uh-oh, a bit too much. And what was happening was that some of the plants that were up this end, giving them a bit of filtering, got moved because they were in bloom and got moved up here. So suddenly there was more light hitting them. And I won't say they objected, because a few little purple tinges is okay, but that means you're getting up to the extreme. You're getting up to the level that the plant is starting to change colour as a consequence. That's the time to have a good think, yeah? Because it may be that will get worse if you don't move the plant, yeah? So a lot of those went down to that shelf, and they've greened up again, so they're fine, caught in time. I've got one exception, which are my Deesas, which are a whole different ball game. They need totally different care regime. If you get any more than at the very, very lowest level of fertiliser on those roots, they'll burn. They like pure water. They also like acidic water, so they're planted in a mix of peat, sphagnum moss and perlite. Yeah? And they can stand in water. They are in effect bog plants. Where they grow, they're often standing in water on the edges of streams, or where water is cascading down rugged cliffs and things like that, and they're in the running water. So they are, by definition, really bog plants. And if the roots dry out, plant dies. It's like almost instant. So they need to stay wet year in, year out. Not quite soggy in the winter, but not allowed to dry. That's my one exception of the Deesas. I hope to get more. So that's a sort of insight into what I get up to out here. I've said the feed levels. I've said what I do with pH. Big reminder in there again about making sure you flush. Yeah, whether they're mounts, whether they're in clay pots, plastic pots. Every now and again, a good flush with clean water. Make sure you're not getting any build-ups or any residual fertilizers or individual elements, and then you sort of re-wet them, and you've got like an overdose in some cases. So good flush now and again, and that's it. Those are my sets, and that's how I work. Come the autumn, that will all change, but during the growing season, it's quite simple really. Feed and water well. Those that need to dry in between, allow them to do so, and then get them wet again. Don't leave them dry for any length of time. Not if they're actively growing. You slow them up. You can even set them back, So when the chance arises, keep the stuff growing, yeah? And even though some of my Oncidium types do actually border on total dry before they get watered, it won't be for any more than a day at the most. And that'll probably be because I had something else to do and couldn't get to them that day. And those that don't like to ever dry out, well, just don't let them. Now in the winter time it won't matter so much, but in the growing season, especially when the temperatures are up, if they're meant to stay moist, make sure they do. And you should be okay. Well, that really is it. Not much more to say. I play with light levels. There are slight differences in temperatures as well on different shelves. The higher the shelf, potentially the warmer it gets. But that's only when the air is at its stillest. Notice I didn't say still, but at its stillest, like it is now. The big circulating fans aren't on. So the only air movement in here at the moment is provided by the little computer fans, which are dotted around. There's a couple up there that keeps everything in the roof just circulating, just moving round. And then the others are positioned, there's one tucked in there in the corner, which just keeps the air moving in that area. And over here, where the cooler growers are, there's one on each shelf on the corner there. It keeps that air moving across those plants. That's really to help keep them cool. It still keeps the air moving. So even though the big fans aren't on, the air is still gently moving. No hot spots and no cold spots. But there are warmer and cooler spots nonetheless. Once the big circulating fans kick on, that's it. Effectively the air is stirred up to such an extent that the temperatures are virtually constant throughout. But there is still a little bit of a cooling effect over here because of the direct tiny little fans straight onto the plants. I mean, the leaves are moving there now, Yeah, so that keeps them slightly cooler, just about. So there we go. It's not difficult, and I would suggest that, you know, think about sets. Think about putting them in a set that involves the frequency of watering. Obviously the highest frequency are going to be mounted orchids, and that's a workload in itself. You know, it's virtually daily, and I've got a lot, so it's a daily thing. It's my choice. But if you don't want that workload or can't do that workload, then try and avoid mounted orchids. Virtually every mounted orchid I've got could be grown in a pot. It's my choice to mount them. I like them. I like, certainly my dendrobiums I like mounted. Come the winter time, there's a very good reason for that as well. Okay, so that's a little bit of a care guide, but again, I'll repeat, it's specific to this environment. You know, I mean, I've got high humidity permanently in here, so obviously plants are not going to dry as fast as they might do in a house. They're not going to transpire as fast and lose the internal humidity out through the leaves because they've got the humid air around them, and it just stops them losing their humidity at quite such a rate. So it is a specific environment, and it is very automated, and not everybody can do that. But for me, that's what I do, and I would say in the main it's working pretty good. Now, I do have some exceptions. I've got some right dodgy plants in amongst some of these. They're not all in peak condition. They're not all bursting with health. They're not all shoving out new growth like they're going out of fashion. There are some exceptions in here, but in the main, I would say things aren't growing bad. And I seem to get most of what I've got to bloom on some sort of regular basis, although there are a few exceptions to that as well. I've still got some total non-bloomers in here, but yeah, that's life. My fault really for not doing the homework on them. I mean, this is one up here. Oh, I doubt if I'll ever get this flipping thing to bloom. That is Rhyncholalia glauca. That needs higher light than my Vandas. Well, it can't have higher light than my Vandas. They get the best light. This is the highest light area here, and the reason should be pretty obvious. It's that line across the roof. That's where my shade netting stops. So for a period of the day, not all of it, but when the sun's high in the sky, the only thing between these plants and the sun is that one layer of bubble wrap and the roofing, which is slightly opaque because that's the polycarbonate stuff. But that's the brightest light I've got, is up there. That's why the Vandas live up there. And during that period, some of these are getting a little bit more light than they ought to get, but the Vandas help shade them, only slightly. And this particular bit on the end here, that gets the brightest light. But then when you get to here, it doesn't, because the shade netting on the roof kicks in. So, and these have got their back to it. And that's something else I do. I have, on my hanging racks up here, I have what I call facing the light and having their back to it. These here have got their back to there where the sun is, whereas round this side they're facing it. So on this side of the rack, this is brighter light than round here. There's another little microclimate I've got. Yeah? You might say, well, why have you got some Tolumnias facing the light and some facing away? Well, this poor thing got a bit frazzled. It's slowly recovering. What happened with this one was it was in bloom a very, very long time, so it lived here. Well, as far as Tolumnia is concerned, that's quite low light levels. So it was a nice bright green all over. And then when it finished blooming, I put it up there, facing the brightest light, and it decided to go totally purple on the top, not on the bottom. So you can see that's direct light. That's what happened. Now it's slowly but surely starting to come back green again, and it is pushing some new growths which are green. So that's why that one's got its back to the brightest light. I'm trying to acclimatise it from not good enough light for the plant itself to what would do quite nicely before it gets round into the bright light. That could take the rest of this year for that to go back green again. My fault. See, these Tolumnias here will come into the same category. These are here because they're in bloom. Oh, I hadn't noticed some more blooms have opened on that. That's smashing. But my species is down here, this one that's been in bloom for ages and this one that's just opening. Now they're not getting enough light there, but if I put them up where they get enough light, I can't see the blooms. What's the point in having plants with blooms on if you can't see the blooms? So for the period they're in bloom, they're not in the best light. They'll have to live with it. That's how things go in here. I sort of think along the lines, if I was trying to grow those in the house, they'd probably be getting less light than they're getting there. Yeah? They could go there. Then they'd get more light because it's open, yeah, to the roof. And I may do that. But the trouble is I move around in that area quite frequently. So anything that hangs out here keeps getting knocked. You can't look where you're going all the time. Anyway, that's a sort of what I get up to out here as far as light, temperatures, watering, frequencies, the sets of the plants and the different types of watering that I apply, plus the feed levels and adjusting pH. The feed I use is the MSU formula. That's it. I only use one fertiliser. It's got everything the orchids need in it. I do supplement with CalMag, sometimes on its own and sometimes a couple of drops in with the fertiliser. In fact, most times at the moment. Everything's growing, you know, needs that extra little bit of calcium, give it a kick and all that. And to adjust my pH, a fair bit of the time I mix my fertiliser in with my water, and if I'm up at around the 130 mark, the pH is going to be about 6.5. I might leave it alone and just leave it like that. That'll be one of my higher end ones. But if I need to drop the pH down, I use a very, very weak solution of citric acid, which I bought in crystals, and I've dissolved a few crystals in a plastic container in a solution form so that I can just add like half a capful into the water, check the pH until it drops down to where I want. Yeah, so those are the things that get used. MSU, some CalMag and citric acid to lower the pH. I don't need to raise the pH, yeah, but if I did, the tiniest amount on the end of my finger of bicarbonate of soda will do the job. If I just don't need to do it. I very rarely put so much citric acid in that I've dropped the pH so far down that I need to bring it back up again. And quite honestly, it doesn't pay to start adding pH down and pH up in the same mix. I'm sure that doesn't do it any good. So yeah, that's all I use, and that's how I go about stuff in here. This has probably ended up being a very long video, and it's really because I've tried to do everything all in one go. But that's how I work, and basically the results aren't too bad at all. I'm quite pleased with how things go out here. It's taken a lot of years. It hasn't always been like this, and I haven't always had a grow room. There was days when it was windowsills and the end of the dining room table, which is just the other side of these doors. Yeah, because this place just didn't work for plants. It was either too hot or too cold. Well, I've dealt with all that now, and this now seems a pretty good growing environment. It's an excellent growing environment for most things. It's pretty good for most of the rest, and for some it's only good at certain times of the year, like this lot. This lot are not happy in the summer. It's just too warm for them, yeah. And the only way I get away with it is the high humidity. And talking of humidity, I've got a concrete floor, so on the warmer days that gets absolutely soaked with water, absolutely drowned. And I'll come back a couple of hours later and do it again if I'm around, and a couple of hours later I'll do it again on those hot days. I'll just keep that floor wet, and it helps the foggers because they struggle when it's that warm. So there we go, quick sort of whiz round how and when and why and all that. Don't forget, that's growing season care. That all changes come the autumn as we head towards the short days, cooler temperatures and much cooler at night. All change at that point. See you next time.